Most people thought the war ended in May 1945. But for George S. Patton, the real enemy had only just revealed his face. When a Soviet general proudly explained how his soldiers had executed American pilots who surrendered behind their lines, Patton realized a new war had already begun, and he had no intention of staying silent. This was not a meeting of allies. It was a confrontation between two different worlds, one built on honor and another built on the cold blood of anyone who stood in its way. As Patton stared at the medals on the Russian's chest, he knew those awards were bought with the lives of boys from Kansas and Pennsylvania. Did Patton go too far by challenging the Soviet Union while the ink on the peace treaty was still wet? Or was he the only man who understood that a monster cannot be a friend? You decide. But what happened behind the closed doors of that headquarters in Linz would eventually lead to a conspiracy to silence the most dangerous general in the American army. If Patton had been allowed to speak then, the history of the 20th century would look very different. The setting was a cold, damp military office in occupied Austria, located near the Enns River where the Third Army's forward elements had finally halted their advance after months of non-stop combat. The air inside the makeshift headquarters was thick, stale, and suffocating, heavy with the lingering smell of cheap, unfiltered Soviet tobacco and the iron grit of tank tracks that had been dragged in on mud-stained boots from the chaotic world outside. While the rest of the planet was supposedly celebrating a hard-won peace, inside these stone walls, the tension was a physical weight that pressed down on everyone present. Patton stood directly across from a high-ranking general of the Soviet NKVD, a man who represented a political system that treated human life as nothing more than a disposable resource in a grand and cynical global game. With a staggering and nauseating amount of arrogance, the Soviet general began to describe the ruthless efficiency of his methods during the final chaotic weeks of the push into the heart of Germany. He spoke with total defiance, his voice echoing sharply off the damp walls as he claimed that any American pilot who crashed in the Soviet zone was treated not as a brother in arms, but as a dangerous spy or a tactical liability. He did not merely admit to the violation of international military law, he bragged about the swiftness of the executions. To this Soviet officer, the professional code of the soldier was nothing but a Western weakness to be exploited, not a standard to be upheld in the face of victory. He showed utter and total scorn for the American idea of military justice, treating the lives of captured airmen as worthless currency to be discarded at his whim. For the Soviet command, an American pilot from the 9th Air Force was not a hero who had risked his life to destroy Nazi supply lines. He was a dangerous witness to the massacres, the systematic looting, and the dark reality occurring in the Soviet-occupied territories. This was a direct, personal strike against every fiber of Patton's being. To see a man wearing the uniform of a victor boast about the cold-blooded murder of unarmed Americans was the ultimate, unforgivable insult to the men of the Third Army and the honor of the United States. Do you believe the Soviets ever truly saw the West as brothers in arms? Or was it always a cold, tactical alliance that hid a much darker and more predatory intent that Patton was the only one brave enough to call out? As the sound of the Soviet general's cynical laughter finally died down, the atmosphere in the room turned to absolute ice. Patton did not shout. He did not immediately reach for his ivory-handled .45 caliber revolvers, though every man in the room expected him to. Instead, he simply stood there, his body frozen in a rigid stance, his gaze fixed on the Russian officer with a piercing intensity that could strip the very paint off a tank's hull. This was the cold fury, a psychological state of mind where Patton was at his absolute most dangerous. Those who served closely with him knew the warning signs. the whitening of his knuckles as he tightened his grip on his leather riding gloves, and the rhythmic, silent pulse in his jaw that indicated he was fighting a war within himself to remain composed. The leather of his gloves creaked loudly in the absolute silence of the room. In those long seconds, Patton thought of the American families in small towns across the Midwest who were currently celebrating, waiting for boys who would never come home. They would be told by official telegrams that their sons were lost in combat against the Germans. But Patton now knew the grim and horrifying truth. They had been murdered by their own allies while trying to surrender in good faith. Every word from the Soviet general had been like the rhythmic sound of a shovel hitting the frozen ground in a mass grave. Patton felt a profound, absolute shame for being ordered by the politicians in Washington to play the role of the diplomat and the gracious host, while his own men were being slaughtered just miles away behind a red line. He looked at the Soviet general and saw exactly what he was: a barbarian in a victor's coat, a man who understood nothing of military honor and everything of raw, primitive terror. The American staff officers in the room shifted their weight nervously, their eyes flitting between Patton's holster and the armed Soviet guards standing stiffly by the door. They could almost smell the ozone in the air, the unmistakable scent of a massive storm about to break. Imagine standing there yourself, representing the most powerful military force ever assembled on the planet, forced by orders to smile and shake the hand of a man who just admitted to executing your soldiers for the sake of political convenience. What would you have done in that position? Would you have remained silent for the sake of the fragile global alliance? Or would you have demanded justice right then and there, regardless of the consequences for world peace? Patton slowly stepped forward, closing the final distance between himself and the Russian until they were barely inches apart. His voice was low, vibrating with a raw, primitive power that made the Soviet guards instinctively shift their grip on their submachine guns and tense their muscles. He did not draw a weapon, but he delivered a verdict that was sharper and more final than any lead bullet. He looked the Soviet general directly in the eyes and told him plainly that he did not consider him a soldier, but a butcher who had stumbled into a position of authority through blood and betrayal. In his private notes from that chaotic period, Patton famously wrote that the Soviet people were a savage race who had no value for human life and absolutely no understanding of Western civilization. In that room, he told the Russian that if even one more American airman vanished behind the Soviet lines, he would not wait for a single telegram from the White House or a polite request from the State Department. He promised the general that he would drive his battle-hardened armored divisions across the Enns River, tear through the Soviet lines like wet paper, and burn every NKVD headquarters between Austria and Moscow before the summer was even over. This was not the empty, desperate threat of a frustrated officer. It was a promise from a man who commanded more mobile firepower, more logistical support, and more battle-hardened tanks than any other commander in the history of human warfare. Patton was not arguing about borders, treaties, or territory. He was taking a final stand for the very soul and integrity of the Western world. The arrogant smirk on the Soviet general's face finally and completely vanished, replaced by a cold, sudden realization of mortality. For the first time in his career, he was staring into the eyes of a man who was truly not afraid of the Red Army, a man who was fully prepared to ignite World War III right then and there, to save the honor of a single American soldier. As Patton walked out of that office, his boots clicking sharply on the stone floor, he did not look back. He had delivered his verdict, and the message was unmistakable. The era of cooperation was a dangerous illusion, and the era of the Iron Curtain had already begun in earnest. This wasn't just a heated argument between two high-ranking commanders. It was the first shots of a Cold War that would last for half a century and define the fate of billions. Do you think Patton was right to speak with such blunt, uncompromising force? Or did his total lack of diplomacy put the entire world at risk of a nuclear catastrophe before the first bombs were even dropped on Japan? The question remains for us today. Why was this explosive story hidden from the public record for over 80 long years? The answer is both simple and devastating. Patton was right too early, and the truth was inconvenient for the political elite. Washington and London were absolutely terrified that his blunt honesty and his refusal to be silent would destroy the fragile alliance with Stalin before they could finish the war in the Pacific. They needed the massive Soviet Union for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands, and so they sacrificed Patton's reputation and his career to keep the peace for just a few more months. They called him unstable, a dangerous relic of a bygone age of warfare who simply couldn't handle the complex transition to a post-war world. They stripped him of his beloved Third Army, the finest fighting force he had ever commanded, and placed him in charge of a dead-end administrative headquarters in Bad Nauheim, effectively silencing the most successful combat commander in the entire American arsenal. They portrayed him in the press as a dangerous warmonger who wanted to keep the blood flowing for his own glory. But Patton's private diaries from 1945 contain a haunting and incredibly accurate prophecy. He wrote that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy and that future generations of Americans would spend their lives and their vast wealth paying for the catastrophic mistake of stopping at the Elbe River. He firmly believed that the only way to ensure a lasting peace for the world was to settle the Soviet question while the American army was still at its absolute peak strength in Europe. Just months after his confrontation in Linz, Patton died in a car accident that many historians, veterans, and former intelligence officers still call suspicious to this very day. He was a man who refused to stop talking about the Red Threat, and many believe he was removed because he had become a dangerous liability to the emerging global political order. The legacy of Patton's confrontation in that cold Austrian office is a question that haunts military leaders and historians today. If we had listened to him in 1945, could we have prevented 40 years of nuclear terror, the division of Germany, and the millions of deaths caused by communist expansion during the Cold War? Or would his aggressive stance have caused a total global catastrophe that would have destroyed human civilization in its tracks? Tell me in the comments. Was Patton a visionary hero who saw the Red Threat coming with perfect clarity? Or was he a dangerous man who simply didn't know when the fighting was finally over and the peace had begun? Let's settle this debate once and for all.
Appreciate you watching all the way through. This was Mike. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.